Commander Victor Brennan made the biggest mistake of his military career when he grabbed Davina Lopez's Barrett rifle from her hands during a live demonstration. What happened next would shatter every assumption about female snipers in the European Defense Force and leave Brennan nursing more than just his bruised ego. This is the story of how one emotional young woman from Barcelona turned a moment of humiliation into a legend that's still whispered about in military academies across Europe. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pyrenees Training Facility as the European Defense Force's elite sniper program began another day of what they called separating wheat from chaff. The facility, nestled in the Spanish mountains near the French border, had earned a reputation as one of the most demanding military training centers in Europe. Only 12 candidates remained from the original 43 who had started the program 6 months earlier. Davina Lopez adjusted her position behind the Barrett M82A1, her dark eyes scanning the targets positioned at distances ranging from 800 to 1,200 meters down the valley. At 23, she was the youngest candidate in the program and one of only 2 women remaining. Her olive skin glistened with a light sheen of perspiration despite the cool mountain air, not from nerves, but from the intensity she brought to every exercise. The Pyrenees facility operated under a rigid hierarchy that had remained unchanged for decades. Commander Victor Brennan, a 45-year-old Austrian with steel-gray hair and shoulders like a linebacker, ruled the program with an iron fist. His philosophy was simple. Snipers needed to be physically imposing, emotionally detached, and mentally unbreakable. In his view, the role required someone who could carry heavy equipment across hostile terrain, remain motionless for hours without discomfort, and take a life without hesitation. Brennan had made his position on female snipers clear from day one. During the opening ceremony, he'd announced that while the European Defense Force mandated equal opportunity, biology didn't. "This program will find your breaking point," he'd declared, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the assembled candidates. "Some of you simply aren't built for what we do here." The daily routine at Pyrenees was designed to eliminate weakness through systematic pressure. Candidates woke at 0500 for physical conditioning that included weighted marches through mountain terrain, strength training focused on functional military movements, and endurance exercises that pushed cardiovascular limits. After breakfast came technical training, ballistics calculations, wind reading, range estimation, and weapon maintenance. Afternoons were dedicated to live fire exercises, with each shot scrutinized and scored. Davina had excelled in every category, consistently ranking in the top 3 candidates across all metrics. Her mathematical background from her engineering studies in Barcelona made ballistics calculations intuitive. Her petite frame, which Brennan saw as a weakness, actually allowed her to maintain shooting positions longer with less fatigue. Most importantly, her emotional nature, which others mistook for instability, fueled an intensity that made her devastatingly accurate under pressure. The other candidates had learned to respect her abilities, even if they didn't always understand her passionate approach to training. Unlike the stoic professionalism that most cultivated, Davina wore her emotions openly. She celebrated successful shots with visible joy, cursed in rapid Spanish when equipment malfunctioned, and argued passionately when she disagreed with tactical assessments. Her fellow trainees called her La Tormenta, the storm, both for her emotional intensity and for the way she could unleash devastating accuracy when conditions demanded it. But Brennan saw only liability. During evaluations, he consistently rated her lower than her performance warranted. When she achieved the program's second highest score in a complex urban simulation, he noted emotional instability under stress in her file. When she successfully completed a 72-hour surveillance exercise that eliminated 3 other candidates, he wrote, "requires excessive emotional investment to maintain focus." The facility's culture reinforced Brennan's perspective. Instructors, all hand-picked by the commander, shared his traditional views about military roles.
They praised candidates who remained expressionless during high-pressure exercises and criticized those who showed visible emotion, positive or negative. Success was measured not just by technical proficiency, but by adherence to an ideal of cold, mechanical precision. This environment created a subtle but persistent form of exclusion. While Davina's scores earned her a place in every advanced exercise, she was rarely selected for the prestigious demonstration roles that visiting officials observed. When international military delegations toured the facility, Brennan showcased candidates who fit his vision of what a sniper should look like: tall, broad-shouldered men who could present their weapons with stoic authority. The exclusion extended beyond ceremony to practical training opportunities. Advanced equipment was distributed based on seniority and readiness for responsibility. Despite outperforming many of her peers, Davina was consistently assigned older rifles for crucial exercises, while newer, more sophisticated equipment went to candidates with lower scores but higher favor with the instructional staff. These patterns weren't lost on the other candidates. Some viewed the disparate treatment as evidence that Davina didn't belong in the program. Others recognized the injustice but remained silent, unwilling to jeopardize their own standing by challenging the established order. The result was an environment where exceptional performance could be overshadowed by failing to fit an institutional image of what success should look like. Today, the storm would break.
Davina Lopez stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds, dimensions that Commander Brennan reminded her of regularly during training critiques. What he failed to mention was that this compact frame housed reflexes honed by years of competitive shooting in Catalonia and a work ethic that drove her to practice long after other candidates had retreated to the barracks. Born in Barcelona to a family of engineers, Davina had grown up surrounded by precision and mathematical thinking. Her father, Miguel Lopez, had introduced her to shooting as a teenager, taking her to competitions across Spain where she'd learned to thrive under pressure. Unlike the controlled environment of the Pyrenees facility, civilian competitions had taught her to channel her emotions into focus rather than suppress them entirely. Her journey to the European Defense Forces elite sniper program had begun 3 years earlier when a military recruiter visited her engineering university. While her classmates showed polite interest in technical roles, Davina had been captivated by the challenge of precision shooting under extreme conditions. The idea of combining her mathematical aptitude with her shooting skills in service of something larger than herself had ignited a passion that sustained her through the rigorous selection process. But 6 months at Pyrenees had revealed the gap between her vision of military service and the reality of institutional bias. This morning's incident would be the culmination of countless small humiliations that had accumulated like pressure in a sealed container. The troll had started during the pre-exercise briefing when Brennan announced the day's evaluation: precision shooting under simulated combat stress. Each candidate would engage targets at maximum range while exposed to noise, artificial smoke, and time pressure designed to replicate battlefield conditions. Performance would be evaluated by a visiting delegation from NATO's Special Operations Command, making it one of the most important assessments of the program. "Today we find out who has what it takes when everything goes wrong," Brennan had announced, his pale eyes scanning the assembled candidates. "The NATO observers want to see how our program produces snipers who can perform under any conditions." As candidates were assigned positions and equipment, Davina noticed the familiar pattern. The newest Barrett rifles went to candidates she routinely outscored, while she was initially assigned an older weapon system with known accuracy issues. When she politely requested equipment commensurate with her ranking, Instructor Valdez had shrugged dismissively. "Rankings don't matter if you can't handle the pressure, Lopez. Prove you can use what you're given before asking for better gear." The comment stunned because it ignored months of evidence to the contrary. Davina had consistently performed better under pressure than under controlled conditions, a trait that should have marked her as exceptional in a program designed to simulate combat stress. Instead, her emotional response to challenge was treated as evidence of unreliability. But this morning, something had shifted. As she watched mediocre performers receive equipment she'd earned through superior achievement, Davina felt her patience finally crystallize into determination. She would not simply endure another day of systematic dismissal. She would force recognition through performance so undeniable that even Brennan would have to acknowledge it. The opportunity came when candidate Morrison, assigned the newest Barrett M82A1, reported a malfunction during equipment check. Standard protocol required reassigning weapons based on backup availability, creating a moment of flexibility in the otherwise rigid system. Davina stepped forward immediately. "Sir, I can take the Barrett. My scores qualify me for the advanced equipment, and I'm familiar with that specific weapon system." Brennan's expression hardened. Around them, other candidates paused their preparations to observe the confrontation. The NATO observers were scheduled to arrive within 30 minutes, making this precisely the wrong moment for what Brennan viewed as insubordination. "Lopez, you'll use the weapon you've been assigned. This isn't a democracy, and your preferences don't determine equipment distribution." "With respect, Commander, this is about optimal performance for the NATO evaluation. My scores demonstrate proficiency with the Barrett system that exceeds—" "Your scores," Brennan interrupted, his voice rising, "don't reflect the intangibles that matter in real combat. Raw marksmanship means nothing if you can't maintain composure when lives depend on it." The accusation was particularly galling because composure under pressure had been Davina's strength throughout the program. Her emotional intensity, rather than undermining her performance, had consistently enhanced it. She felt her face flush with anger, knowing that her visible reaction would be used against her arguments. "Sir, I respectfully disagree. My performance under stress has been consistently superior to candidates who've received advanced equipment assignments." Brennan stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her position. "Performance isn't just about hitting targets, Lopez. It's about fitting into a unit, following orders, and accepting your role without argument. Until you learn that lesson, you'll continue to receive equipment appropriate to your actual capabilities." The dismissal was calculated to end the discussion, delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned compliance. But as Davina looked around at the faces of her fellow candidates, she saw something that made her decision inevitable. A mixture of sympathy and relief that someone else was bearing the weight of institutional bias. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now let's return to the narrative. What Brennan and his instructors didn't know was that Davina had spent every free moment of the past 6 months transforming herself into something far more dangerous than they could imagine. While other candidates were lapsed during off-duty hours, she had been conducting her own advanced training program in the mountains surrounding the facility. Every evening after official training ended, Davina would slip away to a secluded valley she'd discovered 3 kilometers from the base. There, using her personal rifle shipped from Barcelona, she practiced scenarios that went far beyond the facility's standard curriculum. She'd studied weather patterns specific to the Pyrenees region, learning to read wind indicators that were invisible to untrained eyes. She memorized the ballistic characteristics of different ammunition types at various temperatures and altitudes. Her engineering background had proven invaluable in ways the instructors never recognized. While they taught basic range calculation methods, Davina had developed mathematical models that accounted for variables others ignored: air density variations at different times of day, the effect of mountain thermals on bullet trajectory, and compensation techniques for shooting at extreme angles on mountainous terrain. The technical knowledge was only part of her preparation. Davina had also been conditioning her body for challenges that standard training didn't address. She practiced shooting positions that minimized her profile while maximizing stability, techniques that played to her smaller frame rather than fighting against it. She'd learned to use her size as an advantage, finding concealment and firing positions that larger shooters couldn't access. Most importantly, she'd been studying the Barrett M82A1 system with obsessive detail. During equipment maintenance sessions, she volunteered to work on every Barrett that came through the armory. She memorized the weapon's quirks, learned to identify performance variations between individual rifles, and developed an intimate understanding of how different environmental conditions affected its accuracy. Her personal notes, kept in a waterproof journal she carried everywhere, contained detailed analyses of over 300 shots fired under various conditions. She documented wind patterns at different times of day, temperature effects on ammunition performance, and the relationship between her emotional state and shooting accuracy. The data revealed something that would have shocked Brennan. Her best performances came when she was emotionally engaged, not when she tried to suppress her feelings. This secret training regimen had created capabilities that exceeded the facility's official curriculum. While other candidates learned to shoot accurately at standard ranges under controlled conditions, Davina had taught herself to engage targets at extreme distances in weather that would challenge experienced snipers. She could read terrain features to predict wind patterns hours in advance and calculate trajectory adjustments in her head faster than others could use electronic aids. But perhaps most significantly, she developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under self-imposed pressure. During her solo training sessions, she would create stress scenarios that simulated combat conditions, shooting while exhausted from mountain climbing, engaging multiple targets with strict time limits, and maintaining accuracy while dealing with equipment malfunctions she deliberately introduced. The irony wasn't lost on her that the emotional intensity Brennan saw as weakness had become her greatest asset. When other candidates struggled with performance anxiety during evaluations, Davina thrived on the pressure. Her passion for precision shooting transformed stress into focus, converting emotional energy into the kind of concentration that made impossible shots routine. She'd also been quietly observing her fellow candidates, noting their strengths and weaknesses with the analytical mindset of an engineer. She knew that Morrison struggled with wind compensation beyond 800 meters, that Petrov's accuracy degraded significantly when shooting from improvised positions, and that Davidson couldn't maintain precision when engaging multiple targets in rapid succession. This knowledge base extended to the facility's equipment and personnel. Davina had memorized the performance characteristics of every rifle in the armory, knew which instructors favored particular techniques, and understood the unofficial rules that govern daily operations. She recognized that Brennan's bias wasn't just personal prejudice, but part of a systemic pattern that favored appearance over performance. Her preparation had also included studying the political dynamics of the program. She understood that proving her competence wouldn't be enough if it was delivered in a way that allowed Brennan to dismiss it. She needed not just superior performance, but a demonstration so undeniable that institutional bias couldn't explain it away. The NATO evaluation presented exactly that opportunity. With international observers present, Brennan's ability to manipulate narratives would be constrained. If she could deliver exceptional performance under official scrutiny, the political cost of dismissing her achievements would become prohibitive. As she stood in the pre-exercise staging area, watching Brennan distribute equipment according to his personal preferences rather than earned merit, Davina felt the weight of 6 months of preparation. Every evening spent in the mountains, every calculation memorized, every technique perfected had led to this moment. She possessed capabilities that exceeded anyone's expectations, including her own from 6 months earlier. The only question was whether she'd get the opportunity to demonstrate them.
The institutional rationalization for excluding Davina had evolved into a sophisticated system of justification that allowed Brennan and his staff to maintain their biases while appearing objective. During instructor meetings, her consistent high performance was reframed through a lens that transformed strengths into potential weaknesses. Lopez's scores are excellent under controlled conditions, Instructor Valdez had explained during a recent evaluation session, but controlled conditions don't exist in combat. Her emotional investment in perfect performance could become a liability when adaptability matters more than precision. This reasoning allowed the staff to acknowledge her technical superiority while questioning her suitability for field operations. They pointed to her visible frustration during equipment malfunctions as evidence of poor stress management, ignoring the fact that she consistently solved problems faster than candidates who appeared more composed. Her passionate arguments during tactical discussions were labeled as difficulty accepting criticism, despite the fact that her alternative approaches often proved superior to standard doctrine. The most insidious aspect of this rationalization was how it transformed every positive trait into a potential negative. Her mathematical approach to ballistics became over-reliance on calculation rather than intuition. Her physical conditioning regimen was dismissed as compensation for natural disadvantages. Even her perfect attendance and voluntary extra duties were reinterpreted as trying too hard to prove herself rather than natural competence. Brennan had refined these justifications during discussions with visiting officials from other military branches. When asked about the program's gender integration, he would present Davina as evidence of equal opportunity while subtly undermining confidence in her capabilities. "We evaluate every candidate by the same standards," he would explain. "Some excel in training environments, but struggle with the psychological demands of operational reality." The other candidates had absorbed these institutional messages, creating a social environment where Davina's achievements were consistently minimized. During informal conversations, her successes were attributed to luck, favorable conditions, or trying harder than necessary. When she outperformed established shooters, the response was often surprise rather than recognition of earned superiority. "I don't understand how she does it," Morrison had confided to Petrov after a particularly challenging exercise where Davina achieved scores that exceeded the previous program record. "There's something unnatural about being that precise under pressure. It's like she doesn't feel stressed the same way normal people do." This comment revealed the underlying assumption that drove much of the institutional bias, the belief that exceptional female performance must result from some abnormality rather than superior preparation and skill. The possibility that Davina had simply outworked and outprepared her competition was less acceptable than theories about unusual psychology or beneficial stress responses. The scrutiny had intensified recently as NATO's evaluation approached. Brennan had received informal guidance from command levels above the facility about the importance of presenting the program positively to international observers. Female integration was a sensitive topic in military circles, and any problems would reflect poorly on his leadership. This political pressure had created a paradox for Brennan. He needed Davina to perform well enough to demonstrate successful integration, but not so well that it challenged his fundamental beliefs about gender roles in combat. The solution had been to limit her opportunities while maintaining plausible justifications for the restrictions. "Lopez will participate in all standard evaluations," he had assured his superiors, "but we're being selective about which candidates represent the program in high-visibility demonstrations. Experience has taught us that pressure situations can reveal weaknesses that don't appear in routine training." The reasoning satisfied administrative requirements while preserving his control over the narrative. If Davina excelled in routine exercises, it demonstrated successful training methods. If she struggled during limited high-pressure opportunities, it validated concerns about female suitability for elite roles. But this careful balance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Other candidates had begun questioning the disconnect between Davina's performance and her treatment by the instructional staff. Some had started comparing scores informally, noting patterns that were hard to explain through official justifications. Candidate Jensen, a Norwegian with engineering background similar to Davina's, had been particularly vocal during recent discussions. "I've been tracking performance data for my own improvement, and the numbers don't match the equipment assignments. The correlation between scores and equipment distribution is actually inverse in some cases." These observations created social pressure that Brennan found increasingly difficult to manage. The traditional military solution of suppressing discussion through disciplinary authority was complicated by the presence of international observers and the political sensitivity surrounding gender integration.
The NATO delegation arrived at precisely 0930 hours, their olive green staff cars kicking up dust as they wound through the mountain roads toward the Pyrenees facility. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the British representative leading the evaluation team, had a reputation for cutting through military politics to focus on actual capabilities. Her presence meant that today's demonstration would be scrutinized by someone who understood both the technical requirements of precision shooting and the political complexities of gender integration in elite military units. Davina watched from the firing line as Brennan conducted his pre-demonstration briefing for the visitors. His presentation emphasized the program's rigorous standards and comprehensive evaluation methods, carefully avoiding any mention of the selection criteria for today's participants. The NATO observers took notes and asked technical questions about training methodology, unaware of the political undercurrents that had shaped the day's roster. The exercise itself was designed to simulate long-range precision shooting under combat conditions. Each candidate would engage targets at ranges from 800 to 1,400 meters while exposed to artificial smoke, random noise bursts, and time pressure. The Barrett M82A1 rifles had been positioned at numbered firing stations, with assignments supposedly determined by random draw. Davina had drawn position 7, one of the more challenging locations due to its exposure to crosswinds from the valley. More significantly, she'd been assigned one of the older Barrett rifles, a weapon she recognized as having a documented accuracy problem at extreme ranges. The irony wasn't lost on her that systematic disadvantage was being presented as random chance. As candidates began their final equipment checks, Morrison reported his rifle malfunction. The timing couldn't have been more convenient for Brennan's narrative. With NATO observers present, he needed to demonstrate responsive problem-solving while maintaining his preferred distribution of advanced equipment. "We'll reassign weapons based on backup availability," Brennan announced, consulting a clipboard that Davina suspected had been prepared in advance. "Morrison, take position 3 with the backup Barrett. The rest of you maintain your assigned positions." This was the moment Davina had been preparing for. She stepped forward, her voice clear and professional despite the anger building inside her. "Sir, position 3 has optimal wind conditions for the longest shots. Given that I have the highest scores at extreme range, wouldn't it be more appropriate for me to take that position?" The question created exactly the kind of public challenge that Brennan couldn't ignore without appearing arbitrary to the NATO observers. Colonel Mitchell looked up from her notes, clearly interested in how the situation would be resolved. Brennan's response was swift and dismissive. "Lopez, assignments are based on multiple factors beyond raw scores. Position 7 will test your adaptability under challenging conditions, which is exactly what this evaluation is designed to measure." "With respect, sir," Davina continued, her engineering mind automatically calculating the political dynamics, "my adaptability has been demonstrated consistently throughout the program. Position 3 would allow optimal performance for the NATO evaluation, which benefits the entire program." The logic was unassailable, and Brennan knew it. His pale eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, using his physical presence to intimidate. "Lopez, this is not a negotiation. You'll use the position and equipment you've been assigned, and you'll do it without further discussion." But Davina had spent 6 months building toward this moment. Her preparation included not just technical skills, but the confidence to challenge authority when institutional bias threatened mission success. "Sir, I respectfully request clarification on the selection criteria for today's assignments. The NATO observers might be interested in understanding how we optimize candidate performance for international demonstrations." The question was brilliant in its simplicity. It forced Brennan to admit to arbitrary decision-making or defend a system that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, her expression indicating professional interest in the discussion. "Colonel Brennan," she said in crisp British accent, "perhaps you could walk us through your assignment methodology. Understanding how you match candidates to challenges would be valuable for our evaluation report." Brennan found himself trapped between his institutional biases and the need to appear professional to international observers. His solution was typically authoritarian. "The methodology is classified training doctrine. What matters is results, not process." The moment Brennan's hands made contact with the Barrett's barrel, muscle memory from hundreds of hours of combat training took control of Davina's response. Her grip shifted instantly to the rifle's stock, converting Brennan's attempt to disarm her into a leverage advantage that no amount of size difference could overcome. "Sir, I would not recommend," she began, but Brennan was already committed to his course of action. Using his superior weight, he yanked hard on the rifle, expecting easy compliance from someone half his size. Instead, Davina's training kicked in with devastating efficiency. Her left hand maintained control of the weapon while her right hand shot forward, not in a punch, but in a precise grip that captured Brennan's wrist with the crushing force of someone who had spent months developing functional strength. The sound was audible across the firing line, the sharp crack of carpal bones compressing under pressure that exceeded their structural limits.
Brennan's confident grab became a desperate attempt to free himself from a grip that threatened to fracture his wrist. "Release the weapon immediately," he gasped, his face flushing red as he realized the situation had spiraled beyond his control. Davina's response was calm, professional, and utterly devastating. "Sir, you're attempting to forcibly disarm a soldier during a NATO evaluation. I suggest you reconsider your approach." The grip pressure increased incrementally, each adjustment sending shooting pain through Brennan's arm. His 45 years of military experience had never prepared him for being physically dominated by someone he considered fundamentally inferior. The psychological shock was almost as overwhelming as the physical pain. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, her expression shifting from professional interest to serious concern. "Colonel Marin, what exactly is happening here?" Around the firing line, other candidates and instructors stood frozen, watching their unshakable commander being systematically dismantled by the woman he'd spent months dismissing as too small for military service. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate confrontation. Davina maintained her grip while addressing the NATO observer directly. "Ma'am, Commander Brennan attempted to forcibly disarm a soldier during a NATO evaluation. I'm maintaining control of my equipment while requesting clarification of proper protocol." The statement was masterful in its precision. It reframed Brennan's actions as improper while positioning her response as appropriate military behavior. More importantly, it demonstrated exactly the kind of composed thinking under pressure that elite military units required. Brennan made one final attempt to reassert authority, twisting his body to break free from Davina's grip. The movement only increased the pressure on his compressed wrist, sending pain shooting up his arm that made him gasp audibly. "Lopez, you're assaulting a superior officer," he managed, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, I'm maintaining control of assigned equipment while under physical attack. The NATO observers can determine who initiated inappropriate contact." The crowd of witnesses made denial impossible. Everyone had seen Brennan grab for the rifle first, and everyone was now watching him struggle unsuccessfully to free himself from someone half his weight. Colonel Mitchell's voice cut through the tension with military authority. "Both of you will release contact immediately and step apart. This demonstration is suspended pending clarification of what just occurred." Davina released her grip instantly, stepping back with the fluid movement of someone completely in control of the situation. Brennan staggered backward, cradling his injured wrist and trying to salvage some remnant of authority from the encounter. "Ma'am," Davina addressed Colonel Mitchell with perfect military bearing, "I request permission to continue with the scheduled evaluation. This incident shouldn't impact the demonstration of program capabilities." The request was psychologically brilliant. It positioned her as focused on mission success rather than personal conflict, while simultaneously highlighting Brennan's failure to maintain professional standards during an international evaluation. Brennan attempted to reassert control. "Lopez will be removed from today's exercise pending disciplinary review. Her actions demonstrate exactly why she's unsuitable for operational assignments."
As medics attended to Brennan's injured wrist and the NATO delegation huddled in urgent discussion, Davina faced a choice that would define the remainder of her military career. The official evaluation had been suspended, leaving her in professional limbo with no clear path forward, except waiting for decisions made by others about her future. Instructor Valdez approached with obvious nervousness, his usual authoritative demeanor replaced by uncertainty about how to handle a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. "Lopez, you're to report to the administrative building for debriefing. Colonel Mitchell wants to review the incident before making any decisions about your status in the program." The instruction was reasonable and followed proper protocol. Any rational soldier would comply, submit to the investigation process, and trust that institutional justice would ultimately prevail. But Davina had spent 6 months learning that institutional justice and actual fairness rarely coincided, especially when gender bias was involved. She looked across the firing line at the targets still waiting in the valley below, their red centers bright against the mountainous terrain. The NATO observers had traveled across Europe to evaluate the program's capabilities, and that evaluation was being derailed by Brennan's inability to manage his personal prejudices.
The opportunity to demonstrate what she was truly capable of was disappearing into bureaucratic procedures that would likely conclude with her quiet removal from the program. "Sir," she replied to Valdez, "I understand the protocol. However, the NATO evaluation was designed to assess candidate capabilities under combat conditions. The artificial stress created by Commander Brennan's actions actually provides a more realistic test environment than the original exercise plan." Valdez looked uncomfortable with the logic, recognizing its validity while understanding that accepting it would require acknowledging Brennan's inappropriate behavior. "Lopez, the evaluation has been officially suspended. You need to report for debriefing immediately." But Davina had already made her decision. The months of secret preparation, the systematic exclusion, and the physical confrontation had led to this moment where institutional rules conflicted with her deeper obligation to prove that merit should determine opportunity. "Sir, with respect, I request permission to complete the shooting evaluation as originally scheduled. The NATO observers have limited time at this facility, and my performance data could provide valuable information for their assessment." The request put Valdez in an impossible position. Officially, he should order her to report for debriefing. Practically, he recognized that her proposal made operational sense. The NATO team was indeed operating under time constraints, and resuming the evaluation would demonstrate the program's resilience under unexpected conditions. Before Valdez could respond, Colonel Mitchell approached their position. Her expression was unreadable, but her body language suggested someone who had reached important conclusions during her brief consultation with the other NATO observers. "Specialist Lopez, I understand you're requesting to continue with the shooting evaluation." "Yes, ma'am. I believe the NATO team deserves to see actual program capabilities rather than having their assessment disrupted by administrative complications." Mitchell studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing multiple factors beyond the immediate tactical situation. "The original exercise was designed to test performance under combat stress. Would you say that recent events have created adequate stress conditions for a realistic evaluation?" The question was loaded with implications. Mitchell was essentially asking whether Davina could perform under pressure that exceeded anything the training staff had originally planned. The physical confrontation, the bureaucratic uncertainty, and the watching crowd of colleagues and international observers had created exactly the kind of high-stakes environment that separated competent soldiers from exceptional ones. "Ma'am, I believe current conditions provide an optimal test of combat readiness. Real battlefield situations rarely follow training protocols, and adaptability under unexpected stress is precisely what this program should be measuring." Mitchell nodded slowly, then turned to address Valdez. "Instructor, what's the current status of the firing range and target systems?" "Fully operational, ma'am. The targets are set at ranges from 800 to 1400 meters, with wind conditions varying across the engagement zones." "And Lopez's assigned equipment?" Valdez glanced nervously toward the administrative building where Brennan was receiving medical attention. "She's been assigned to Position 7 with backup equipment, ma'am." Mitchell's expression sharpened. Backup equipment for someone who apparently has exceptional performance scores. The question hung in the air like smoke from artillery fire. Valdez realized that his response would either support or contradict the narrative Brennan had been constructing about merit-based assignments. The 15-minute preparation period became the most intense quarter hour of Davina's military career. As she settled into Position 7, the weight of 6 months of preparation converged with the knowledge that everything she'd worked for depended on her next few shots. Colonel Mitchell and the NATO observers positioned themselves at the spotting station with high-powered telescopes and electronic scoring equipment. Their presence transformed the routine firing exercise into something approaching a combat situation, complete with the kind of performance pressure that revealed true capability under stress. Davina began her preparation ritual with the methodical precision of an engineer approaching a complex calculation. She studied wind indicators across the valley, noting the subtle variations that would affect bullet trajectory at different ranges. The afternoon sun had heated the mountain slopes unevenly, creating thermal currents that would push projectiles in unpredictable ways. The Barrett M82A1 she'd been assigned was indeed one of the older weapons, but her months of armory volunteer work had made her familiar with its specific characteristics. She knew this particular rifle pulled slightly left at extreme range and required compensation for a trigger that broke heavier than newer models. Most importantly, she understood that this demonstration had to exceed not just normal expectations, but the heightened standards created by the morning's confrontation. A merely good performance would be dismissed as adequate but unremarkable. She needed results that would be undeniable even to observers predisposed to doubt female capabilities. The target array stretched across the valley in a pattern designed to test different aspects of precision shooting. Near targets at 800 meters would assess basic marksmanship under time pressure. Middle-range targets at 1,000 meters tested wind compensation and trajectory calculation. The extreme range targets at 1,400 meters were positioned at the edge of the Barrett's effective capability, requiring perfection in every variable, from ammunition selection to firing position. Lopez, you're cleared for the demonstration sequence. Engage targets in numerical order, beginning with target 1 at 800 meters. You have unlimited time for the first 3 shots, then 60 seconds per target for the remaining sequence. The protocol was more demanding than standard exercises, designed to test both precision under careful conditions and accuracy under time pressure. Davina settled behind the Barrett, her body automatically assuming the shooting position she'd practiced thousands of times during her secret training sessions. The first shot broke clean, the Barrett's massive recoil absorbed by her properly positioned body. Through the scope, she saw the spotting disc appear in the target's center ring, indicating a hit that exceeded the minimum requirements for the demonstration. But exceeding minimum requirements wasn't enough for what this performance needed to accomplish. The second shot, also at 800 meters, but into a crosswind that had shifted during the 30 seconds between engagements, required compensation techniques that went beyond standard training. Davina adjusted her point of aim using calculations she'd developed during her private study sessions, then delivered another center ring hit that drew murmurs of approval from the observation post. The third shot, completing the precision phase of the demonstration, went into the target's center with an accuracy that made clear this wasn't luck, but systematic competence. She'd established a baseline that transformed the time pressure phase from a test of basic capability into a demonstration of advanced skill under combat conditions. "Outstanding shooting, Lopez," Mitchell's voice carried across the range. "Proceed to time pressure sequence, beginning with target 4 at 1,000 meters. You have 60 seconds from my mark." The timer began, and Davina shifted into the combat rhythm she'd practiced during her solo training sessions. 60 seconds to acquire the target, calculate compensation for increased range and changing wind conditions, and deliver a shot that would maintain her perfect record. The mathematics flowed automatically through her mind: bullet drop at extended range, wind deflection based on current conditions, adjustment for the rifle's specific ballistics. Her body moved with mechanical precision, each motion economical and purposeful. The shot broke with 23 seconds remaining on the timer. The spotting disc appeared slightly off-center, but well within the acceptable scoring zone. More importantly, the time management demonstrated exactly the kind of efficient performance that combat situations demanded.
Target 7 waited at 1,400 meters, positioned on a ridge that made it barely visible, even through the Barrett's powerful scope. At this distance, the bullet would travel for nearly 2 seconds before impact, during which time wind conditions could shift multiple times along the trajectory path. Most candidates never attempted shots at this range during routine training, and those who did rarely achieved scoring hits. Davina settled into her final firing position, knowing that this shot would define how everyone present remembered the day's events. The NATO observers had grown quiet at their spotting station, understanding they were witnessing something beyond routine demonstration. Through her scope, she could see heat shimmer rising from the sun-warmed rocks, creating optical distortion that made precise target acquisition nearly impossible. But her months of secret training had included practice sessions under similar conditions. She'd learned to read the mountain thermals and predict how they would affect both optical clarity and bullet flight. The wind patterns at 1,400 meters were completely different from those at her firing position. She could see tree movement and dust patterns that indicated changing conditions across the valley. Her mental calculations incorporated variables that standard training never addressed: how terrain features would channel wind at different elevations, how temperature differences would create vertical air currents, and how the bullet's flight time would interact with changing conditions. 60 seconds for target 7, Mitchell announced, though her tone suggested she understood that this shot represented something beyond normal evaluation criteria. Davina settled into her final firing position, knowing that this shot would define how everyone present remembered the day's events. The NATO observers had grown quiet at their spotting station, understanding they were witnessing something beyond routine demonstration. Through her scope, she could see heat shimmer rising from the sun-warmed rocks, creating optical distortion that made precise target acquisition nearly impossible. But her months of secret training had included practice sessions under similar conditions. She'd learned to read the mountain thermals and predict how they would affect both optical clarity and bullet flight. The wind patterns at 1,400 meters were completely different from those at her firing position. She could see tree movement and dust patterns that indicated changing conditions across the valley. Her mental calculations incorporated variables that standard training never addressed: how terrain features would channel wind at different elevations, how temperature differences would create vertical air currents, and how the bullet's flight time would interact with changing conditions. 60 seconds for target 7, Mitchell announced, though her tone suggested she understood that this shot represented something beyond normal evaluation criteria. Davina began her final sequence with the calm precision of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. She adjusted her scope for the extreme range, compensated for wind conditions that existed only in her mathematical models, and controlled her breathing with meditation techniques that transformed physical stress into mental focus. 30 seconds remained when she settled into her final aim point. Through the scope, the target appeared as a tiny red dot that wavered in and out of focus due to atmospheric distortion. Most shooters would have taken the shot immediately before conditions changed further. Instead, Davina waited. Her secret training had taught her to recognize the brief moments when atmospheric conditions aligned for maximum accuracy. She watched the heat shimmer patterns, monitored the wind indicators, and waited for the convergence that would create optimal shooting conditions. With 15 seconds remaining, the moment arrived. The heat shimmer settled, wind indicators showed temporary stability, and her breathing cycle reached the natural pause that preceded the perfect shot. The Barrett roared, its massive muzzle blast echoing across the valley like thunder. The recoil drove her shoulder backward, but her position absorbed the impact without disturbing her scope picture. Through the optics, she tracked the bullet's flight toward the distant target. At 1,400 meters, even a Barrett's projectile was visible as a brief streak against the mountainous background. Davina watched it arc across the valley, following a trajectory that incorporated months of mathematical study and practical experimentation. The impact came 2 seconds later, marked by a puff of dust from the target area. For a moment, silence dominated the firing line as everyone waited for the spotting disc that would indicate hit or miss. When the red disc appeared, it was positioned dead center in the target, marking not just a scoring hit, but a perfect shot under conditions that challenged even expert marksmen. The NATO observers erupted in spontaneous applause, their professional reserve overcome by witnessing exceptional performance. But the real revelation came when Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio system. "Lopez, that's the first perfect score at maximum range in this program's history. Would you mind explaining how you achieved that level of accuracy under these conditions?" Davina's response revealed the depth of preparation that had made the impossible shot routine. "Ma'am, I've been studying wind patterns and atmospheric conditions specific to this valley for the past 6 months. I developed mathematical models for bullet trajectory at extended range and practiced the necessary compensation techniques on off-duty hours." The explanation transformed her performance from lucky shot to systematic expertise. More importantly, it demonstrated that her emotional investment in exceeding program standards had driven her to achieve capabilities that surpassed even the instructor's knowledge. "And the equipment limitations," Mitchell continued, referencing the older Barrett rifle that should have made such accuracy impossible. "Ma'am, I've worked on every rifle in the armory during maintenance periods. I know the specific characteristics of each weapon and can compensate for their individual quirks. Preparation overcomes equipment limitations." The response revealed not just technical competence, but the kind of professional dedication that transformed good soldiers into exceptional ones. Her months of volunteer armory work, dismissed by Brennan as inappropriate ambition, had created expertise that enabled perfect performance despite systematic disadvantage.
The aftermath of the perfect shot created a moment of crystalline clarity that cut through months of institutional bias and political maneuvering. Colonel Mitchell lowered her spotting scope and walked directly to Davina's position, her expression reflecting someone who had witnessed something beyond routine military competence. "Specialist Lopez," she said, using the formal address that indicated official recognition. "That demonstration represents the highest level of marksmanship I've observed in 15 years of evaluating sniper programs across NATO forces." The words carried weight beyond simple praise. They constituted professional validation from an international authority whose opinion could override local command prejudices. More importantly, they were spoken in front of witnesses whose accounts would spread throughout European military circles. Behind Mitchell, the other NATO observers approached with expressions of genuine amazement. Major Heinrich Weber from the German contingent consulted his electronic scoring tablet with obvious disbelief. "The precision calculations required for that shot exceed standard training curriculum by significant margins. How extensive was your advanced mathematics education?" Davina's response was characteristically direct. "Sir, I have an engineering background, but the mathematical models I used were developed through independent study. Standard ballistics training doesn't address the complex variables present at extreme range in mountainous terrain." This revelation prompted an exchange of glances among the NATO team that spoke to professional implications beyond the immediate demonstration. They were witnessing not just exceptional shooting, but innovative problem-solving that could benefit their own national programs. Captain Maria Santos from the Spanish military stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "Lopez, your compensation techniques appear to account for variables that our standard doctrine doesn't address. Would you be willing to document your methodology for potential inclusion in NATO training protocols?" The request represented exactly the kind of professional recognition that Davina had been systematically denied throughout the program. Her unofficial innovations were being considered for official adoption by international military forces. But the most significant moment came when Instructor Valdez approached with obvious uncertainty about how to process what he'd witnessed. For 6 months, he'd supported Brennan's narrative about Davina's limitations, contributing to her exclusion from advanced opportunities. "Lopez," he said carefully, "your performance today exceeded anything we've seen in this program. I need to understand how you developed these capabilities without official advanced training." The question contained an implicit admission that institutional assumptions about her limitations had been fundamentally wrong. More importantly, it acknowledged that she'd achieved superior results despite systematic disadvantage, rather than because of favorable treatment. Davina's response was measured but pointed. "Sir, I recognized that my success in this program would require exceeding standard requirements. I used off-duty time to develop additional capabilities through independent study and practice." The explanation highlighted the injustice of her treatment while maintaining professional courtesy. She'd been forced to work twice as hard as her peers to achieve recognition that should have been based on demonstrated competence. Colonel Mitchell intervened before the conversation could become more uncomfortable for the facility staff. "Valdez, I think we need to discuss Lopez's performance scores throughout the program. If today's demonstration is representative of her consistent capabilities, there may have been systematic errors in her evaluation process." The diplomatic language masked a pointed criticism of how Davina had been assessed and assigned throughout her training. Mitchell was essentially demanding an explanation for why exceptional performance had been treated as routine competence. This request put Valdez in an impossible position. Defending the previous evaluation system would require admitting to bias, while acknowledging errors would implicate the entire command structure in systematic discrimination. Before Valdez could respond, a commotion from the administrative building drew everyone's attention. Commander Brennan emerged with his injured wrist in a medical sling, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The combination of physical pain and professional humiliation had created a volatile emotional state that promised additional confrontation.
The medical tent had become an impromptu command center, where Brennan nursed his injured wrist while trying to salvage his reputation from the morning's catastrophic events. The fracture wasn't severe, but the psychological damage was irreparable. Word of his confrontation with Davina had spread throughout the facility with the speed of military gossip, each retelling amplifying the humiliation of being physically dominated by someone he'd systematically dismissed. Colonel Mitchell entered the tent with the measured stride of someone preparing to deliver career-ending news. Her expression was professional but unforgiving, reflecting hours of witness interviews and documentation review that it painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination disguised as professional evaluation. "Commander Brennan," she began without preamble, "I've completed my preliminary assessment of today's events and the broader patterns they revealed about program management." Brennan attempted to maintain his authoritative demeanor despite his compromised position. "Colonel, I hope you understand that Lopez's behavior represents exactly the kind of emotional instability that makes her unsuitable for operational assignments. Her assault on a superior officer—" "Stop." Mitchell's interruption carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your characterization of events contradicts every witness account and video evidence from the evaluation. You initiated physical contact by attempting to forcibly disarm a soldier during an international demonstration." The reference to video evidence sent a chill through Brennan's remaining confidence. Modern military facilities recorded all training activities, and those recordings would provide irrefutable documentation of his inappropriate behavior. Mitchell continued with methodical precision. "More significantly, my review of program records reveals patterns that suggest systematic bias in evaluation and assignment procedures. Lopez's performance scores consistently exceed those of candidates receiving preferential equipment and training opportunities."
The accusation was devastating because it was accurate. Brennan had spent months developing justifications for treating exceptional performance as routine competence, but those rationalizations couldn't withstand scrutiny from someone familiar with objective evaluation standards. "Colonel, you have to understand the context." "The context," Mitchell interrupted again, "is that one of your candidates just delivered the most exceptional marksmanship demonstration in NATO evaluation history using equipment that was deliberately assigned to create disadvantage. That's not context, Commander. That's evidence of command failure." Outside the medical tent, Davina was conducting her own reckoning with the program's instructional staff. Valdez had requested a private conversation to address the obvious disconnect between her demonstrated capabilities and her previous treatment within the program. "Lopez," he began awkwardly, "I need to acknowledge that your performance today exceeded our assessment frameworks. It's clear that we may have underestimated your capabilities throughout the program." The admission was carefully worded to minimize institutional responsibility while acknowledging obvious error. "Sir, with respect, my capabilities haven't changed since yesterday. What changed is that someone with authority witnessed them firsthand rather than accepting second-hand assessments colored by institutional bias." Valdez winced at the directness of her response, but couldn't dispute its accuracy. Her performance had been consistently exceptional, only the recognition had been systematically withheld. "What would you need from the program going forward to reach your full potential?" The question revealed how completely the power dynamic had shifted. Instead of Davina proving her worthiness for opportunities, Valdez was now asking what the program could do to deserve her continued participation. "Sir, I need evaluation based on demonstrated performance rather than preconceptions about who belongs in elite military roles. I need equipment assignments that reflect earned merit rather than social dynamics. Most importantly, I need leadership that recognizes exceptional performance when they see it." Each requirement was a pointed criticism of how the program had operated under Brennan's command, but delivered with the professional courtesy that made criticism irrefutable rather than inflammatory.
6 months after the incident that shattered Commander Brennan's career and transformed European military training protocols, Davina Lopez stood before a classroom of NATO instructors at the International Sniper Training Symposium in Geneva. Her presentation on environmental variable compensation for extreme-range precision shooting had become required curriculum across 12 different national military programs. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. Brennan had been quietly transferred to administrative duties, his leadership style deemed incompatible with modern military equality standards. The Pyrenees facility itself had been redesigned around merit-based evaluation protocols that Davina had helped develop. But the changes extended far beyond individual careers or single institutions. The video footage of her perfect 1,400-meter shot had become legendary in military circles, not just for its technical excellence, but for what it represented about hitting potential and systematic bias. "The mathematical models I'm presenting today," Davina explained to the international audience, "were developed because institutional training didn't address the complex variables present in real-world shooting situations. When soldiers are forced to exceed official curriculum to achieve excellence, that's evidence that the curriculum needs upgrading." Her point was diplomatic but pointed, highlighting how military organizations often failed to recognize innovation emerging from unexpected sources. The techniques she'd developed during her secret training sessions were now being taught to elite soldiers across 3 continents. Major Weber, the German officer who had witnessed her original demonstration, served as symposium moderator and provided context for her presentation. Instructor Lopez's work represents the most significant advancement in long-range shooting doctrine in the past decade. More importantly, it demonstrates how organizational bias can prevent recognition of exceptional talent.
The comment reflected broader changes in how European military forces approach talent development. New protocols required multiple evaluators for candidate assessment, eliminated subjective criteria that correlated with demographic characteristics, and created advancement pathways based solely on demonstrated performance. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on the women who had followed Davina through military training programs. Her success had created permission for others to refuse artificial limitations and demand opportunities based on proven capability. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, representing the British contingent, approached Davina after the presentation. "Instructor Lopez, your example changed how I approached my own training. Instead of accepting others' assessments of my limitations, I developed capabilities that exceeded their expectations." These individual transformations multiplied throughout military systems, creating cultural change that extended far beyond sniper training. The principle that exceptional performance should be recognized regardless of its source had become embedded in institutional thinking. The personal cost of transformation had been significant but worthwhile. Davina's confrontation with Brennan had required her to risk her military career for principles that extended beyond individual advancement. But that risk had created opportunities for countless others who would benefit from merit-based evaluation systems. Her former classmates had scattered across European military assignments, but many maintained contact to share how her example had influenced their own career development. Morrison, who had received preferential treatment under the old system, had become one of the strongest advocates for objective performance standards. "Lopez showed us that excellence looks different than we expected," he'd written in a letter that now resided in Davina's personal files. More importantly, she proved that organizations become stronger when they recognize talent wherever it emerges. The broader lesson extended beyond military applications to any institutional setting where systematic bias prevented recognition of exceptional capability. Davina's story had become a case study in business schools, leadership programs, and organizational development curricula worldwide. During quiet moments between official duties, she often returned to the valley where she'd conducted her secret training sessions. The landscape remained unchanged, but its meaning had transformed completely. What had once been a place of solitary preparation had become a symbol of how individual excellence could challenge institutional limitations. The Barrett rifle that had triggered the confrontation with Brennan now resided in a display case at the NATO Training Center, accompanied by a placard explaining how one perfect shot had revolutionized international military training standards. But Davina knew the real transformation hadn't been in weapons or techniques, but in understanding that potential could emerge from sources that hierarchies often overlooked. As she prepared for her next assignment, developing advanced training protocols for joint international operations, Davina reflected on the journey from excluded candidate to recognized expert. The emotional intensity that Brennan had dismissed as weakness had proven essential to achieving the level of excellence necessary to overcome systematic disadvantage. Her legacy wouldn't just be in the techniques she'd developed or the institutional changes she'd inspired, but in proving that individual courage to challenge unfair systems could create opportunities for everyone who followed. The perfect shot had lasted only seconds, but its impact would reshape military training for generations to come.